Well, as I was saying, when they got back from their miserable breakfast with the green mold floating in the little cup of yogurt, two of the men who were brought up decided they didn't want to work. So they started running around the room, trying to find a way out. But the door that they had come in, that everyone had come in before, was no longer there. There was no door on the wall. There was only a door going back down to the disgusting dining room. There was no way to get out of the room. There were no windows. There was nothing. Nothing but the fat little mean old man. You remember him, don't you? Huh? And the big, hairy, smelly, ugly guys who started to close in slowly on these two men who were running around from one wall to another, from one machine to another, looking, yelling, "Help! Help! Someone help us!" But who could help them? No one could help them. It was hopeless. Eventually one of them tripped, and the big lumbering guy came up and picked him up by his neck with two hands. First one hand, then two hands. And he started to squeeze his neck. When the other guy saw that, he said, I give up. Don't, please, I'll go to work. And the other big guy went over and picked him up by his neck. And the little mean guy said, "So, you don't want to work, eh? Well, you'll now see what happens to wise guys who don't want to work." Oh, everybody was quiet. They stood in their places. They hadn't been chained to their machines yet. They didn't know what was going to happen. What was going to happen? And then they heard a terrible roar. What was that? Suddenly, out of a closet came, well, was he a man? I don't know. He was sort of shaped a little like a man, although he walked on all fours, and he had the face of a cat. Of a cat! Yes. The cat started to stalk around the room. The cat started to stalk all around the room. Yes. He went. And the big guy took one of the guys and started to lay him down on the ground and hold him down by the throat while his feet were kicking and his arms were flailing and were waving. And the cat started to come closer, and the cat had big teeth, big fangs, and it turned out that the hands weren't exactly the hands of a man. They were sort of a little bit like a hand, but claws with long nails. And the monster man cat started to walk toward the guy who was lying there, and just then Dov yelled, "Stop! Stop!" And everyone was shocked, because up to now, nobody ever said anything, because they were too afraid. They didn't know if they said something would happen to them. And sure enough, the evil little man said, "You have something to say? It better be good." Well, Dov did have something good to say. He was a very serious boy. Well, he wasn't exactly a boy. He was a big boy, He was almost a young man. And he stood there and looked at the little guy and walked over to the big, hairy, ugly, smelly guy and looked him right in the eye. And he went over to the little guy and he looked him right in the eye. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever had the nerve. It was a little bit scary. Yehudah wasn't so sure it was a good idea. But Dov, which I think you know means bear, started to sort of like hunch up his shoulders. And he was a pretty big guy. He was built strong. And he hunched up his shoulders, and he went up to the Catman, and he looked the Catman right in the eye. Yes. And the Catman realized he was dealing with somebody or something that was different than he'd ever dealt with before. You know what it was? Courage. Dov, the bear, so to speak, was filled with courage. He was not afraid. Actually, what he thought to himself is, this situation is so bad that it probably can't get worse. But after a few minutes, the big, hairy, ugly, and smelly men and the little weaselly, mean guy started to realize, well, what's going on here exactly? They were shocked. It's true, they were shocked. They didn't know what to make of this. But as they began to regain their composure, their sense of, they're in charge, the little guy said to Dov, he said, what have you got to say? You better say something, and it better be good, because otherwise you will be next. Well, Dov looked the old little guy in the eye, and he said, well, here's what I'll tell you. I'm new here. I just arrived. I've only been here one day. I've noticed that the people don't work all that hard, and they don't get that much done. We may be chained to the machines, but we don't really do anywhere half as much as we could do if you treated us decently. If you fed us decent food, if you gave us a decent place to sleep, we'd still be prisoners. You know what they were, by the way? Let me take it aside. In English, there's a word called shanghaied. A man can, or a woman, but mostly men, can be shanghaied. Shanghai is a city in China. I think you know that. But the term is not used to refer to the city in China. The term is used for years and years ago when a ship needed sailors. The men who worked for the ship would go out with clubs, and they would find some poor guy, maybe he was drunk, and they would clunk him on the head, and the next thing he would wake up, he was on the ship, he was a member of the crew, and he was all the way out in the ocean. There was nothing he could do. I guess it must have happened in the city of Shanghai many, many hundreds or whatever years ago. But the term is called shanghaied. The boys had been shanghaied. The boy said, so we've been shanghaied. He said this to the little fat, mean man. We don't have, there's no door. We can't get out. You're probably wondering what happened to the door. Well, the door gets kind of covered by a wall. And it happened, while they were down having their first meal, and no one really thought about it, until they got back up. Now, the guys who were running around, they did know it. They had been there before, but Dov and Yehudah had no idea. And, hope, they say, hope springs eternal. People always can hope. And these two guys, they knew there was no door, but they just thought, well, maybe it would reappear. Maybe somehow, somewhere, somewhat, there would be a door. They didn't think. When you're desperate, you don't think. You don't think when you're desperate. These guys were desperate. They had been there already a year. Anyway, Dov made this pitch to the little fat mean man. First time the mean man ever heard anything like that. And he thought about it. He thought.